Welcome to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Libby Fischer Hellmann. Libby, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I feel like we were talking before the show started, and we just have so much in common. We could just gab for the next hour about what we have in common.
I know, I thought so too. And I would love for you to start with this with how did you get into writing?
Well, I was a big reader. That's number one, and I was always a big reader. And my mother was a huge mystery reader. Her father was a big mystery reader, and she got the habit from him. And I wouldn't read mysteries; I would read thrillers because thrillers were more suspenseful. And I read Ludlum, and I read Le Carré, and I read Len Deighton, and they were mostly British back then. Um, and then my mother gave me a book one day. I guess I was in my 30s, and she said, "Here, try this." And it was a mystery by a guy who's passed on now. His name was Jerry Healy. And it was called The Staked Goat. And it was his second book. And it wasn't a thriller. There were no pyrotechnics. There were no, big, crises or climaxes or things, but it was a super book because not only did it talk about the current times, there was a sub issue in there, and this was after the Vietnam War was over, and it was how there was a black market in the weapons that the U.S. had left behind in Vietnam, and how everyone was taking advantage of it. And, from my journalism days, anything like an issue, bing, 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 the red lights go on. And I say, ooh, you can talk about issues and mysteries. And I later got to know Jerry, and he said, oh yeah, they're kind of like the muckraker books of today. And I said, yeah. So I got closer to wanting to write, but I didn't write. I didn't write for like another 10 years, and that's a whole other story, which we can get to later if you want. But that's kind of how I started inching toward it.
So I know you have a journalism background, which lends itself to obviously writing. But when you're writing in a journalistic fashion, you're thinking of the pyramid and how to make sure everything at the top is much more important to make sure you've said in case it all
Yep.
below the fold, but essentially a form of technical writing, a corporate style writing is different than writing nonfiction but especially writing fiction. So what was that transition like? Like, how did you make that transition?
It was a long transition because you're absolutely right. I knew how to write nonfiction, but I didn't have a clue about fiction. And the first manuscript I wrote was so bad that 5 years later, when I had a few books published, and I wanted to go back and rewrite it so maybe we could publish it because the story wasn't half bad. I only got up to page 25. And I said, this is so bad. I'm not even gonna try it. There was a huge transition. And luckily I was in a terrific writers group. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too small. And when I joined, I remember saying that, we would read our sections out loud to everyone else, and then we would go around the room and everyone would give us their comments. And the first time I read, I'm going through my section afterwards, and I'm saying, I don't think you guys missed a single line. That's how much I needed to learn about writing fiction. But I did. And I'd had 3 practice novels. Why I continued, I don't know, because I had an agent during that time. He dropped me. I had a short story published. It won an award. But selling a novel, forget it. I couldn't do it. So finally, when the agent dropped me, he said, I really think you should change your voice. I think you need to change your stories, your characters, and agents too, because I don't want to represent you anymore. Well, after I picked myself up off the floor and cried and drank a couple bottles of wine, I said, okay, maybe he's got a point. So I wrote a completely different story. And that was the book that got published. The first book that got published was called An Eye for Murder. And it was about a woman who lived in the suburbs of Chicago, where I live. And she used to be in journalism, which, of course, I used to, as you did too. And now she was making corporate films or videos or whatever she got paid to make, like I did after I left my wonderful cushy PR job. And and it was about her getting mixed up in a mystery. And that's what I had needed to do, and it worked. And I will never forget, Jen, the time that I read the first chapter of that book to my writing group. Everyone was as silent as, as a tomb, and I'm thinking, oh, I really screwed this up. They're going to kick me out of the group, and they're going to say, not, forget it, and you're never going to be a writer. And the woman who had been toughest on me in the group, when they came around for comments, she said, "You found your voice." And
Oh.
that, to me, is still one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten and it wasn't even published yet, but it made me feel like, I just won the Miss America contest.
I love that. I love, and I would feel that way too. I mean, oh my goodness, that's awesome. So you've touched on a few things I would love for you to expound upon. One of which is that you called it, the first couple of books there, practice books.
Right.
Would you expound upon that? I love that you said that.
Well, to me, they weren't practice books. I really had the hope that, okay, well, this one will get published. Well, this one will get published. But they didn't, even though I would send them around to agents. And so in hindsight, I realized that they had been practice novels because each one was better than the last, but it wasn't quite publishable yet. The fourth one wasn't either, but I had a terrific editor and she helped me make it publishable. I mean, after she sent me her first valuation, I literally had to go and lie down. It's all single space. It was like 4 typed pages, single space.
My
Um,
goodness.
she really helped me groom it and shape it, and it was invaluable. And those principles that she taught me, like not outlining for me, sank in, and I began to write, 100% better with the following novels.
I love that so much. And so when you made the shift, so not only did you shift so that they were like, here's a new voice or here's a different direction, but what did that feel like when you started to feel the groove? Like you're at this writer's critique, you get the feedback that, wow, you've found this voice and you can feel it and you have now heard it. So
Yeah.
now what? What did you do with that?
Well, I eventually wrote 2 female-led series. I really didn't feel confident about my writing skills until recently, and I still, have days when I say, "Oh, I'm a sham, I'm a fraud, everybody's gonna see through me," that imposter syndrome, and I just have to plow through it. But I guess it was after about 5 or 6 novels that I said, "You know what? I've done it 5 or 6 times. I can probably pull it off again." You know, just like probably. The other thing is that I like to set myself a challenge in every book I write. Something's a little different. Something's a little new. It's the perpetrator is someone you wouldn't expect. Of course, that should happen in almost any novel. But I started to write historicals. I also write historical thrillers. Not my most recent book, but the book before is called A Bend in the River, and it wasn't even a mystery. It was straight historical fiction. So that was a huge challenge for me. It was about the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese point of view, and we went to Vietnam, and of course, it's completely different now. It's two generations past the war, so everything has changed. But it was really good to be there and get a sense of the smells and the way that so much of the population is still in poverty, especially in the cities. And you go winding down these alleys in a motor scooter, and there's the smell of urine, there's the smell of cats, there's the smell of cabbage cooking, the smells, which I think is perhaps one of the most underrated senses that we write about, were really something. And the food was something, and the prices were so low. I couldn't believe it. But anyway, so yeah, I do try to go either literally or figuratively to the location that I'm writing about, and that really helps.
You mentioned also here that you were talking about series, that you've written series. And I know that your most recent book is also a part of a series. So I would love for you to talk a bit more about one. So when you're writing thrillers, because you need to have a really strong antagonist as well as a strong protagonist, you also need to have to be able to drop the clues at just the right time, plus the detours. So when you're thinking about that for one book, much less a series, I would love for you to talk a little bit about like how to get your head around that, how to start, how would someone even start something like that?
Well, the first few books are pretty much, you kind of have an idea, for me, the ideas came. It was the fourth, fifth, and sixth book that tripped me up, because once you've done three books, I would say, in a series, you've got to sort of really go a little deeper and figure out what kind of story is going to work for this character. She's established now. She's got some things going on. She's got her own arc. There's a few supporting characters that come in with every book. But you need to keep a series fresh. So it's hard. It's hard to keep things fresh. So what I did in Double Blind, which was number 6 in the series, I have 2 stories, and I didn't really want them to intersect. Sometimes you have 2 stories and they're going to intersect at some point in the story. This one, I didn't want to intersect. I was going to take each one separately and see what happened. But it turned out that my protagonist was the intersection between the 2. There wasn't
Nice.
anything else. There wasn't an external factor, but the fact that she was working on 2 different cases came together, and they sort of blended into each other in that way, because she was in danger for in both cases, but she only thought she was in danger in one of the 2 cases.
So, following this thread a bit more, so when you are writing, for instance, within the one book, obviously there needs to be some kind of conclusion, even if it's not all wrapped up, or there's the we're we're happy for now concept, in the sense of things are resolved somewhat for now. And so, but when you have like the two pieces going on, the two different storylines happening, was it a better flow to just allow that to continue into something else, or to still wrap it up also into this
I
one
wrapped
book?
it up, but a lot of people are asking me whether I'm going to continue one of the characters that was introduced in one of the stories, because I left it. Okay, it was a case of mistaken identity. One of the characters who was in danger looked very much like my protagonist. So the people that were after the woman mistakenly thought it was Georgia Davis, my protagonist. And I never explained why they looked alike. And so a lot of people said, well, do you think they were cousins, or maybe they were long lost sisters, or are you going to do that in number 7? And so many people have asked me that, and I didn't mention it at all. I just got to the end of the story that I'm wondering whether I should. So that might be something that I pick up again, or I might, I've done that occasionally. I've not a big hanging thread, but a little one. I could address that in the next book.
That's fair. That's fair. So you mentioned something that you did with the historical fiction specifically, whereby, getting to know the area, whether physically or just the research that you've done, leveraging smell in particular. So showing, allowing that showing versus telling happening so that you're immersing the reader into the experience, into the story with the characters. How does the skill set that you were utilizing for the historical fiction parlay over to the thriller writing?
Perfectly. I mean, it was almost as if I was writing a thriller, and in some cases, I thought I was writing a thriller because there is one. I teach workshops on suspense, how to build suspense into your book, and I love suspense. That's what started me reading thrillers, and I love to stay up way too late, because I have to find out. I have to finish it. So there's a lot of suspense in A Bend in the River. In fact, almost every chapter I could have ended it, with a cliffhanger, but you're not supposed to do that, so I didn't. But there was a lot of suspense during the Vietnam War, and there was a lot. It's about two sisters, and they have very different paths through the Vietnam War, and one is beautiful and ends up as a bar girl in Saigon. The other one is much more political and ends up fighting with the Viet Cong against South Vietnam. So there was a lot of opportunity to put in suspense and action, particularly on the woman who was fighting. Um, but there was suspense and action on the other side too. I mean, at one point she gets pregnant, and the stuff that a bar girl might go through. So I did humongous amounts of research. But you know what, Jen? I think that's probably the best book I've ever written.
Really? That's awesome. That's cool when you feel that, when you feel something that
Yeah.
you're just so proud of the work that you just created.
Yeah,
But
because
now I was going to say, you've mentioned something that I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, which is something I particularly like, especially in thrillers, is the suspense, is building the fear, if you will, because that really is a key piece of making it a thriller. So would you share some suggestions or tidbits that perhaps somebody who's writing a thriller might be able to look at their own work and say, have I done enough of this?
I think the main thing is to delay as much as possible the resolution of something that is mysterious and unknown or people have questions about. Because when you question something or you're anticipating something, but you don't know what it is, that's real suspense. So I really love it when writers do that, and I want to find out what the suspense is, and then I do that. I try to do that in my own writing. What are people fearing? What are they anticipating? How long can I string it out before I have to reveal something? And when you reveal something, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. It's like a clue or part of it. And I'll digress for just 1 second, because every time I start a novel or I'm writing a novel, every choice that I make narrows what can happen in the novel itself. You have a blank screen. I start page one. I've already narrowed my options. So the same thing happens with suspense. Once you do one thing on page, let's say 98, you can't go ahead and do something completely opposite on page 179. I mean, it has to be part of or tripping up the protagonist again. And that's the other thing, is that you confront your protagonist with obstacles that he or she must overcome in order to move forward. Now, some of those obstacles might be red herrings and take the protagonist sideways. So the protagonist not only has to solve that sideways obstacle, but then has to run back to the main plot and realizes that he or she has lost time dealing with that extraneous red herring, And so that in itself is suspense. Oh my God, she's running out of time. How is she going to do that? So there's a lot of techniques that can build suspense if you know how to use them. And I was doing some of them before I developed this workshop. And I developed the workshop because I wanted to know what I was doing.
I
What
love that. I
was,
love
what
that.
was working and what wasn't. So it is the most, I guess, popular workshop that I do, and I love doing it. And it works for nonfiction too.
Mhm.
So a lot of the techniques do. And then I do it for readers, and I tell them, you're never going to look at a book or a movie in the same way again. You're going to hate me after this because you're going to know what's going on.
No, but what I like about what you just described too is that when you're writing suspense, when you're building that tension, it what another way you could easily do that is adding a timeline to it. The moment that you say we have a countdown of sorts or
That's
something has to
exactly
get
right.
done, I mean,
You
that's
can have you can have a time countdown. You can have a
mhm,
distance countdown. He was 100 yards away. Now
mhm.
he was 50 yards away. Now you can have a character timeline. John was doing this in New York while Mary was doing this in DC and somebody else was in Chicago. You can have all sorts of timelines, and you're absolutely right. That's one of the staple techniques in suspense, and I use it all the time. Yeah.
That and when I think of suspense too, and when I'm reading, I'm looking for the 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 senses being brought in to create well, what is happening, what might be the internal dialogue, and letting that play out so that you see the character struggling a little bit more, which may or may not be actually what's happening, but to feel subtleties that are happening and to almost amplify them, at
That's the
least.
mark, that's the writing. Once you've figured out what the obstacle is gonna be, then you have to write it with your sensory details and make it come alive for a
Mhm.
reader, or else it's gonna fall flat. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
So
You're
when you were so when you were talking about how this course can also help nonfiction writers because of the tension, if you will, that you're delaying a
yeah,
solution of sorts,
yeah.
would you talk a little bit about that? Because I love how this technique that is really could be focused a bit more in fiction and specifically suspense is something that can parlay to other genres, including nonfiction.
Well, in nonfiction, you build your case and then you come to the conclusion. What does all of this mean? So, in building the case, you're actually building a little bit of suspense. It's more of a academic suspense, depending on what you're writing. But some readers are going to figure it out before you get to that main point. It's almost like inverting the way you write nonfiction. I was taught you put your thesis right at the top so no one's going to get lost, and then you back it up with evidence. But I like doing the evidence first, the examples or what you're going to draw from, and then saying, what does that mean? Boom. This is what it means. And this is how we can fix it, or this is how we can, do it. So it's kind of, turning the pyramid upside down just for articles, not for news stories.
I love that. I love that way to describe it. Absolutely. That's so cool because by the time you get to that point, you've shared the evidence, you're at the thesis or the point, but it also starts to show to make sure you're shifting to the reader so the reader understand what's in it for them, what they are going to be able to take away from it. And then they've almost also started to buy into, I need this because you've presented me with the facts, the evidence, the the rationale ahead of time. So that's
Yeah.
awesome. I love how you described that. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Definitely, definitely.
It's
So,
born out of years of desperation and work and hard work.
oh, but I love that, and I love that it's something that you're showing that if you open the aperture and you look at what's going on, you can take something that's working in one format and apply the idea or the concept to a whole different venue, but you're going to get the same you'll get a cool reaction. You'll get a your
So
reader will get a great experience from it. And that's really what, when someone's picking up a book, in my opinion, when they're picking up nonfiction, they're looking for a solution. The book is a part of that solution. They have a problem, and the book is a part of the solution. In fiction, the what they're looking for is an escape. They're looking for, an adventure or an escape, and the book is a part of that solution to provide that. So you're applying different techniques, but it's still providing the reader with an outcome that they were looking for.
exactly, exactly. I'm about to write an article on um, controversial topics in fiction, particularly, I guess, detective fiction. And what are, because when one of the stories in the most recent series book that came out is about COVID. And when I was writing it, we were right in the middle of COVID. And
Oh.
I was wondering, you know what? I don't know. I don't know if people are going to like this or not. And it came out in March, and I got two people who wrote me and said, "How could you deal, COVID, blah, 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 it's so close." And I figured someone close to them had passed away from COVID. And I said, I totally understand. And, pick up the next one if this, but, but very little resistance. I mean, were, I was surprised that was very little resistance to this controversial topic. And yet there are other topics that publishers and editors and agents are very loath to take on in fiction. And so it's an interesting situation we're in. I don't think people are as rigid as the publishers think they are, particularly in this, environment, which is politically divided theoretically and culturally divided. It's like, oh, don't publish that. That's gonna anger people on the left, or that's gonna anger people on the right. I don't believe that. I think fiction is a way, if you do it sensitively and you're not putting people down, it's almost, and I'm going to sound really hunky dory here, to bring people together. I mean, I may be imagining that, but to me, I'll go with it.
But I can understand that. I mean, when you're writing something, when especially when it's fiction, there's still an outcome. There's still a result that whether I mean, rom-com has its own expectation, but thriller and suspense have their own too. And you want to see the bad guy get caught. You want to see, or if the bad guy wins again, it's one of those of going, oh, but there's a series. Now this is not resolved because this guy has to go down at some
I
point.
did that.
Be-
I did that in one book. I did have a guy that we thought you thought he jumped in the river, in the Chicago River, and drowned. But it turned out he didn't drown. 3 books later, 4 books.
exactly. Exactly. Libby, this has been so much fun.
Oh, me
I love
too.
this so much. Thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people connect with you? Where can they find out about your course? And where can they get your books?
It's all on my website, which is libbyhellman.com. And that's Hellman, like the mayonnaise, with 2 L's and 2 N's, and Libby with 2 B's. Everything is there. There's a section on my books. There's a section on the presentations that I do, and anything else. Probably too much information, as they say, TMI. But this has been delightful for me too, Jen, and I hope we can do something again together.
Yes. Thank you so, so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.